In this first part of our lecture on the sensory system, we will be talking about the somatosensory pathways for pain and temperature. We'll begin, however, with a general overview of the sensory system. Our sensory system gives us information about both external and internal environments. We're going to be focusing on how the information from our external environment gets up to the brain. For the internal environment, I'm going to be kind of focusing on muscle and joint sensation as opposed to visceral sensation. Sensory information is really a nerve impulse that is generated due to a particular type of stimulus. Sensation is being aware that a stimulus has taken place, whereas perception is the interpretation of that sensation. Perception is going to take place in the brain. It can be conscious perception, or it can be subconscious or unconscious perception. There are things going on all the time that we don't attend to, and so we're not even aware that we know that that particular stimulus has taken place. And so our perception can move back and forth between being aware or unconscious of that stimulus and being unaware of that stimulus. For example, when you put a watch on, you generally then become unaware of that stimulus, even though it's applying some pressure to your wrist. It all occurs at an unconscious level after you've first put it on. But when I bring your attention to it, now you can feel the watch on your wrist, or the ring on your finger, or the shirt on your back. Just like maybe you don't notice it at all, but then you have a tag on your shirt and that tag begins to irritate your neck, then you're going to become aware of it again. So you flipped from an unconscious or a subconscious awareness of the sensation of the shirt against your back or the tag against your skin to now being aware and conscious of that sensation. Our somatosensory pathways start off with a somatosensory receptor, and we talked about all those in the prior lecture. Somatosensory receptors are basically biotransducers. They take some type of a stimulus, it could be mechanical or chemical or thermal, and they change it into action potentials, into an electrical impulse. They do this via modality-gated ion channels, because the activation of the receptor opens up modality-gated ion channels. This allows sodium to rush into the peripheral axon, and that sums to create an action potential. Our somatosensory neurons are going to be our afferent neurons. Afferent meaning information coming into the central nervous system. They, again, are pseudo-unipolar. Once the information gets into the central nervous system, however, it needs to follow a particular pathway to get from the entrance point, which when we're talking about the body is the spinal cord, and get up to the brain for us to perceive the sensation, be it unconscious or consciously, and then to respond to that stimulus in an appropriate manner. We have different tracts or fasciculi that carry this information up to the brain. This is not done by a single neuron. We do not have one neuron that goes from the receptor all the way up to where it needs to get to the brain, but we have a series of neurons. You are going to need to know the general location of these tracts or fasciculi within the central nervous system and their relationships to each other. Recall that white matter is going to contain axons, and it appears white because of the fat content within myelin. Axons that have similar functions are going to travel together to the brain. And again, it is these groupings of axons that are called tracts or fasciculi. If we disrupt this pathway anywhere from its starting point at the receptor to its ending point in the brain, we're going to alter our perception of that particular sensation. Here is a spinal cord section. This is a typical example of an image. Your book also has some nice images of the spinal cord with the various sensory and motor tracts on it. In this lecture, we're focusing initially on the sensory, and next week we will be looking at the motor. So in this picture, sensory tracts or fasciculi are represented in blue. And we can see that the right half of the spinal cord and the left half of the spinal cord are mirror images of each other. In the very back part of the spinal cord, we have what is known as the dorsal column, because it's dorsally located, and a column means that you have a group of tracts or a group of fasciculi running together. Within that dorsal column, we're going to have two fasciculi that you will need to know. We have the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus, and we'll come back to these when we get to the particular sensations that travel in those fasciculi, so don't worry about it yet. In this image, they're called the gracile fasciculus and cuneate fasciculus, so you might see the terms either way, but I refer to them as the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. I'm going to go to the right side. As we travel to the right, the next blue section we come to is the posterior spinocerebellar tract. I'm going to want you to know the tracts that I'm going to name. I'll let you know if there's a tract that you do not need to be familiar with. The next one we come to is the anterior spinocerebellar tract. I am not going to ask you to know the location of that particular tract. So you should know so far the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus making up the dorsal column. You should know the general location of the posterior spinocerebellar tract. And you should know the general location of the anterolateral system. The anterolateral system is broken up into the lateral spinal thalamic tract and the anterior spinal thalamic tract. We are learning more and more that there's quite a bit of overlap between these particular tracts. So instead of knowing lateral and anterior, I just want you to know spinothalamic. So the anterolateral system is made up of the spinothalamic tracts. Those will be the sensory tracts that I'm going to ask you to be familiar with. So you will not need to know the spino-olivary tracts that are listed here. Another thing, though, that I would like you to be familiar with is going back to the dorsal column. You'll notice that this image shows sacral, lumbar, thoracic, and cervical sections. And you will want to know that our sacral neurons coming from the sacral part of the spinal cord are going to be the most medially located neurons, whereas the neurons coming into the spinal cord at the cervical level are the most lateral part of the dorsal column. And this will make much more sense as we go through the various tracts in more detail. So if I were to give you an image like this, just a cartoon representation of a spinal cord, I would want you to be able to draw in the tracts that we just talked about. The dorsal column, its two parts, the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus, the posterior spinocerebellar tract, and the spinothalamic tract, making up our anterolateral system. Now, in the spinal cord, we can take the gray matter of the spinal cord, that's the part that looks somewhat like a butterfly in the middle, and it is broken down into functional regions called rhexis laminae. these are really histologically different parts of that area, which happen to correspond to function. I want you to know this very generally. So this is not going to be something that I want you to really put lots and lots of time into. I want you to have a general idea of what the different functions are of the different laminae. There are 10 of them. On the left-hand side of this image, you can see kind of a rough drawing of the various laminae. So when we look at our dorsal horn, the dorsal would be the part that's closest to the top of your computer screen. That would be the back of the spinal gray matter. That's where we have lamina 1. And then it just moves forward through the dorsal horn. So basically the dorsal horn contains laminas 1 through 5, maybe 6. 6 is starting to get kind of into what we call the intermediate level, but we'll say 1 through 5 or 6. The intermediate area, kind of in between the dorsal and ventral horns, we have lamina 7. In those parts of the spinal cord that contain a lateral horn, that is part of lamina 7. And then we have the ventral horn, which contains laminas 8 and 9. And then lamina 10 is right around the central canal. So just knowing that, we know that laminas 1 through 5, or maybe roughly 6, that's going to be incoming sensory information. Because the dorsal horn, we're going to be thinking sensation entering the spinal cord. We know that the ventral horn contains our outgoing motor neuron cell bodies. So we think of 8 and 9 as being, there's our voluntary motor neuron area. The intermediate area, lamina 7, is going to have interneurons, neurons that are going to connect the dorsal horn to the ventral horn, or connect maybe one side of the spinal cord to the other, or connect one level above or below the spinal cord to this particular level. So it's going to be interneurons, in between neurons. And then if there is a lateral horn, it's also going to be the location of our autonomic neuron cell bodies. And this is all just from what you learned in anatomy. This is going into more detail, but if you know what I just talked about, you'll be fine. Pain and temperature tends to be in the outermost part of the dorsal horn. So lamina 1, lamina 2. This information is really, the detail is more if you're reading an article on a pain condition, and they talk about these marginal layer or the substantia gelatinosa, you can refer back to your neuro notes and go, oh, that's what that means. I'm not going to test you on knowing the special names for these different lamina. But the more superficial or dorsally located lamina are going to be pain and temperature. As we get deeper, we're going to get into non-noxious information like touch. Lamina 7, as I said, is where we're going to find interneurons, but also preganglionic cell, autonomic neuron cell bodies. If we are in the thoracic or upper lumbar spinal cord, or down at the sacral level, S2, 3, 4, where our parasympathetics are located. And then laminas 8 and 9, but particularly lamina 9, is where we have our voluntary motor neuron cell bodies. And then lamina 10 just surrounds the central canal. So we're going to go through pathways for various sensations, sensation by sensation. So we're going to take it one at a time. You're going to be needing to do some drawing, so make sure you have your colored pencils handy. And you have your elephant drawings. I would suggest that you have larger versions for these as opposed to the tiny little versions in your handouts. Pain is a really complex phenomenon, and we're going to have an entire lecture on pain, but even that is not going to allow me to get into the depth of how complicated pain is, because we only have one lecture, and pain could be an entire class all by itself. There are multiple pathways that pain information takes getting up into your brainstem and brain in order for our nervous system to respond to that pain and to recognize that pain. We have what we call a primary pain pathway. Not great terminology, because it really doesn't mean it's the most important one. What this means is that this is the discriminative pain pathway, would be a much better word for it. This is what's going to tell us where we have pain and how and somewhat the intensity of that pain. So there are 4 basic types of painful stimuli. There's mechanical, there's thermal, heat and cold, and then there's inflammatory or chemical. The receptor we've mentioned is a nociceptor. You'll recall that from our prior lecture. This is a free nerve ending. There's no connective tissue capsule. Pain information is carried on A delta and C fiber from the skin area. Now, if we're talking deep tissue, we should really refer to those as type 3 and type 4 afferents. The spinal cord pathway that takes this pain to our brain for the discrimination of recognizing pain and localizing pain is called the spinal thalamic tract. This is again part of the anterolateral system. In some sources, you will see them specify the lateral spinal thalamic tract. And that is because much of the information that goes to the part of our brain that's going to allow us to localize the pain, to say where it is going to travel up the lateral spinal thalamic tract. But recent evidence indicates that the anterior spinal thalamic tract also carries some of that information, which is why we're just going to talk about spinal thalamic tract, and we're not going to distinguish between the 2 parts. The information that travels through the spinal thalamic tract is going to go up through the brainstem, get to the cerebrum, and it's going to run to connect to another neuron in the thalamus. Recall that the brainstem is made up of the medulla oblongata being most inferior, the pons, and then the midbrain being the most superior part of it. Superior to that in the cerebrum is our thalamus. All sensations, with the exception of the sense of smell, go to the thalamus before they can go to the cerebral cortex to be consciously perceived. So if something only gets to the level of the thalamus, you still actually have a kind of this general crude perception of the sensation, but you can't give it the discriminative aspects of location and possibly intensity. When the pain information gets to the cortex, it goes to a region called the primary somatosensory cortex. The primary somatosensory cortex has a somatotopic organization. That means that it's very organized so that different parts of your body are represented in different parts of the cortex, and it's consistent from person to person. So you can kind of imagine a picture of a person laying down on top of your brain. This is what we call the sensory homunculus. More sensitive areas, so places like your hand and your fingers, your lips and your tongue, these areas have greater densities of somatosensory receptors, and they get larger areas of the cortex designated to them. So when we look at a picture of a homunculus, you're going to find that the face and the hand has a huge region of the cortex dedicated to it, whereas your legs and your trunk has a relatively small area, even though in reality they have a much bigger proportion of your body. This is a link to an image of the sensory homunculus. You also have a picture of the sensory homunculus on page 113, figure 6-13 in your textbook. So again, I want you to look and see how much of that cortex is devoted to your hand and your face. Look how big the lips are. And then the relatively small area that your legs and your body gets in comparison. Your foot is a little more sensitive again, so it gets a bit bigger space. In fact, your foot gets a bigger area of cortex than your leg does. So this is based on density of those sensory receptors. You should be familiar with the homunculus so that you could tell me that the face and the hand is represented on the more lateral aspect of the primary somatosensory cortex, whereas the foot and the leg is represented medially in the longitudinal fissure. That's the groove between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. The trunk being kind of right up at the top, at the curvature, right before it goes down into the longitudinal fissure. And then that area kind of in between would be for the arm. So you should have a real general sense of this sensory homunculus for when drawing your images. Now let's fill in some blanks. I want you to try and fill in the blanks, and then I will go through the answers with you. So first we have a receptor that is stimulated. What is the name of the receptor that provides this information about pain? When you stimulate this receptor, it results in the opening of ion channels at the trigger zone. What type of ion channels are opened? If we have sufficient summation of these different EPSPs at the trigger zone to generate action potentials, those action potentials are going to propagate along what size first order neurons? And where are the cell bodies of these first order neurons located when we're talking about information that's going to be entering the spinal cord? So we're talking spinal nerves. Our first order afferent is going to enter the spinal cord, and it's going to terminate or end in a particular part of the spinal cord. What part is that? So I want you to work on the answers so that you can fill in the blanks. And I just want to mention that when pain information enters the spinal cord, all our sensation enters the spinal cord through what's known as Lissauer's tract. We labeled that in the first lecture of the semester. This is kind of like the entranceway or the vestibule of our spinal cord. With pain information, we want that information to be able to quickly get to other parts of the spinal cord if you need to pull yourself away from something that's hurting you. And so when it enters Lissauer's tract, in addition to going into the gray matter of the spinal cord, the primary axon is also going to give off some collaterals, which are going to travel up Lissauer's tract and down Lissauer's tract to get to other parts of the spinal cord. So the pain information can get to multiple parts of the spinal cord very quickly to allow you to move away from whatever is creating the painful stimulus. Now let's go ahead and fill in those blanks. So we have a nociceptor stimulated. If you're a muscle physiologist, you're going to be calling that a type 4 receptor in the muscles or joints. This is going to cause modality-gated ion channels to open. If we have sufficient summation to generate action potential, the action potential is going to be propagating along an A delta or C first order afferent if we're talking skin. If we're talking muscle or joint, we're going to call that afferent a type 3 or type 4 afferent. Remember, they're the same size and myelination. It's just location that determines what you call it. The cell bodies for these first order afferents are located in the dorsal root ganglion. And the axons are going to terminate in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. Here is an image of a spinal cord segment. I'd like you to draw out what we just had written in text form. So now I want you to take it from the text form and I want you to put it into a drawing. This will let you know that you really understand what's happening. So you're going to need to have your receptor. You're going to need to have your first order afferent. Remember, it's pseudo-unipolar, so you know how to draw it correctly. It's going to enter into your spinal cord, and it's going to end in the dorsal horn. I want you to pause the lecture and do your drawing, and then restart the lecture, and I'll show you what my drawing looks like. Here is my drawing of pain information entering the spinal cord. I have my nociceptor or type 4 receptor. The action potential is going to be traveling along an A delta or C first order afferent, otherwise known as a type 3 or 4 first order afferent. The cell body is located within the dorsal root ganglion. Its central axon enters the spinal cord through Lissauer's tract and is going to terminate in the dorsal horn. Once in the dorsal horn, our first order afferent is going to synapse with a second order neuron. The second order neuron crosses the spinal cord in front of the gray matter in what's called the anterior white commissure. Commissure means a crossing. White tells us, oh, we're in the white matter, not the gray matter anymore. And anterior is telling us in the front rather than in the back. So it pretty much is telling us exactly where this neuron is going. So it's going to cross to the other side of the spinal cord to the contralateral spinothalamic tract. STT is an abbreviation for spinothalamic tract. It's going to travel up the spinothalamic tract all the way through the brainstem until it gets to the thalamus. When it gets to the thalamus, it's going to synapse with a third order neuron in a particular part of the thalamus known as the ventral posterolateral nucleus. This is abbreviated as VPL. So the thalamus is really a concentrated collection of different nuclei. And you will need to know several of these particular nuclei that make up the thalamus. The third order neuron then is going to go from the VPL nucleus of the thalamus to the primary somatosensory cortex. And this is where we're going to have a conscious perception of pain and be able to give it some discriminative information such as where is it. One other note is that when we're talking about the second order neuron, there is some evidence that the second order neuron ascends rostrally a little bit as it's crossing the spinal cord. So it doesn't just go straight across, but it kind of goes up as it's crossing. Think of it as being, a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. So if I go all the way across and then go up, I can cut that distance a little bit if I start going up right away. This is going to have an effect on how pain information is impaired with a particular type of spinal cord injury. So it's not important for now. We're not going to try and draw it. But when we get to spinal cord injuries at the end of this unit, I want you to kind of keep that in mind. So for now, just put that way in the back of your mind. So to summarize again, we have our first order afferent. It's going to synapse in the dorsal horn with a second order neuron. The second order neuron is going to cross the spinal cord through the anterior white commissure and enter the spinothalamic tract on the opposite side of the spinal cord. It's going to ascend up in that tract all the way up till it gets to the thalamus of the cerebrum. And there it's going to synapse in the ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus with a third order neuron. The third order neuron is then going to go to the primary somatosensory cortex, where we will then perceive the pain and be able to give a location to that pain and to some extent the intensity. Some of this information also goes to an area called the secondary somatosensory cortex, but I want you to focus on the primary at this point. Now, we need to talk a little bit more about the primary somatosensory cortex. We talked about the homunculus. So the part of the cortex that this third order neuron goes to is going to depend on where the pain is coming from. If it's coming from our foot, that third order neuron is going to go to the medial aspect of the primary somatosensory cortex, located deep in the longitudinal fissure. If it's coming from our finger, that third order neuron is going to go to the lateral side of the cortex, located on the outside edge of the brain. If it's coming from our knee, it's kind of going to be right by that longitudinal fissure, kind of as it's going from, you're curving over the top, about to enter the longitudinal fissure. So the exact location on that cortex depends upon where the pain stimulus is taking place. The other thing I want to mention about the primary somatosensory cortex is that it is located in the parietal lobe. It is located on the post-central gyrus. We have a groove that separates the parietal lobe from the frontal lobe, called the central sulcus. Immediately in front of the central sulcus is a gyrus. A sulcus is a groove, whereas a gyrus is a ridge. So the ridge that's in front of the central sulcus is called the precentral sulcus, because it's before the sulcus. The ridge right behind the central sulcus is called the postcentral gyrus. The primary somatosensory cortex is on the surface of that postcentral gyrus. So it is in the parietal lobe. It's the very most anterior aspect of the parietal lobe. Here are some links to images of the primary pain pathway that you might find to be helpful. You also have, of course, images in your textbook. And I'm going to recommend that you take a look at figure 6-14 on page 114 to see the primary pain pathway. And you will note that the green pathway shown in figure 6-14 is coming from the foot. So somebody stepped on something sharp. And you can see that the third order neuron is going medially at the cerebral level to the cortex inside the longitudinal fissure. Whereas the red pathway, which is coming from the hand, maybe somebody poked themselves with a pin in their hand, that one you can see the third order neuron is heading more laterally on the cortex to where the hand is represented. So the placement of the third order neuron is important, and it will become very important when we talk at the end of the semester about strokes and the blood supply to these different regions. Now I want you to get your elephant picture, and this is where you probably want a larger one than the little bitty slide in your handout, in order to draw this primary pain pathway. I want you to take a look at those pictures. I want you to look at figure 6-14 and see if you can draw a primary pain pathway for yourself. Once you've done that, then I want you to come back and take a look at my drawing. And here is my drawing of a primary pain pathway. I have drawn mine on the opposite side of the one that's in your book. So we have a nociceptor. Again, if we were talking muscle and joint, we could call it a type 4 receptor. But in this case, I'm looking at skin, and I'm specifically talking about pain at the dorsal aspect of the proximal thumb. My action potential is going to travel along an A delta or C first order afferent. Because I'm in the skin, that I know that's what I would name it. But because of its location, I also know that it would be traveling in the radial nerve. So this is where I'm going to ask you to take your knowledge from anatomy and pull it in to your neuroscience. You'll need to remember what the cutaneous innervation of the different nerves. So if I think about the dorsal aspect of the proximal thumb, and I go back to my cutaneous sensation maps from anatomy, I will see that that area is supplied by the radial nerve. The cell body is in the dorsal root ganglion. It enters through Lissauer's tract, goes into the dorsal horn, and I know that it's going to be at the C6 level of the spinal cord because my dermatome tells me that. So again, I'm going to go back to anatomy. I'm going to pull in that information and go, well, this is going to be entering the spinal cord at the level of cervical 6 or C6. In the dorsal horn, it's going to synapse with the second order neuron. The second order neuron is going to cross the spinal cord through the anterior white commissure. So that's that little bit of white matter right in the front there between the two sides of the spinal cord. It's going to enter the spinal thalamic tract on the contralateral side of the spinal cord, where it's going to ascend up, go all the way through the brainstem, and get all the way into the thalamus. It's going to go to the ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus, where it's going to synapse with a third order neuron. The third order neuron then is going to go to the more lateral aspect of the primary somatosensory cortex. And because this is primary somatosensory cortex would be located on the post-central gyrus, I know I'm going to be in the parietal lobe. So I'm able to label the lobe that I'm in of the cerebrum. I'm able to label the specific part of the cortex. I'm able to label the thalamus and now a particular nucleus within the thalamus. I'm able to label my neurons. I know which peripheral nerve I'm traveling in, and I know which part of the spinal cord I'm entering. So some of this information you'll need to go back and review in order to answer the questions on it. And that's basically going to be dermatomes and cutaneous innervation. So there are, as I mentioned, pain is very complicated, and there are several additional pathways for pain to get to other parts of the brain. Pain is actually an emotional response, a cognitive response, as well as a physical nociceptive response. It's not just here's a painful stimulus and here's where it is and here's how intense it is. Excuse me. The intensity of pain can be modified by how and what you're thinking and how and what you're feeling. And other aspects of pain, like how unpleasant it is, can vary based upon what you feel and think at that particular time and your past experiences. So there are many, many parts of your brain that affect your actual perception of pain. Excuse me. Additionally, there are parts of your brain that can decrease the information getting up to the cerebrum, or can increase the amount of pain information getting up to the cerebrum. So again, it's extremely complex. And so we have what they call secondary pain pathways. These contribute to the modulation of pain, or the modification of the pain signals getting up to the brain, also modifying how you perceive that pain. So I just want to mention a couple of these. We're not going to draw these out. I'm not going to expect you to draw these out. Your book does talk about them and does some drawings. You should be aware that these exist, but that's about as much as I'm going to ask you to know at this point. So some of the secondary pain pathways include the spinal reticular, spinal mesencephalic, and spinal hypothalamic tracts. You have a region within the brainstem. It pretty much runs the length of the brainstem, makes up a huge part of the brainstem, called the reticular formation. Going from the spinal cord to this reticular formation is the spinal reticular tract. And this part is important for attention and arousal. So when we feel pain, it sends this information to the reticular formation, which makes us pay attention to it. When something hurts, you tend to get aroused. You see things like your blood pressure going up, your heart rate goes up. Depending on the extent of the pain, you may start to sweat or other things. And that's all related to this spinal reticular path. Mesencephalic tells us midbrain. So remember, that's one of the words I asked you to know, is that the midbrain is known as the mesencephalon. So when I see spinal mesencephalic, I know, oh, that's going from the spinal cord to the midbrain. This helps to trigger pathways that actually go back down to the spinal cord and help to decrease the pain signals that are going to the brain. So it helps us to inhibit pain. And then spinal hypothalamic is going to the hypothalamus, which is going to help to modulate some of those autonomic responses. So spinal reticular kind of helps us pay attention and gets us aroused, so we're attending to whatever it is that's hurting us, whereas more the blood pressure, heart rate responses, those kinds of things are being dictated by the hypothalamus. Again, there are lots of areas associated with pain, and I've listed a few of them here. You are not familiar with these areas yet. So all I want you to know is that pain doesn't go just to the primary somatosensory cortex. It goes there to help us discriminate where we hurt, but it goes to many other areas of the brain as well. And then visceral pain is kind of unique because it may not travel just in the spinal thalamic tract. It may have more than one pathway. Again, I'm not going to ask you to know this. All I'll have you know is that visceral sensation in general appears to ascend in the spinal cord bilaterally instead of just on the contralateral side. Itch is closely associated to pain, but it's distinct to pain. It has different types of ion channels for itching than pain does. Its receptor would be a free nerve ending. It's primarily going to travel on a C fiber, maybe some A deltas, but mostly Cs. And it takes the spinal thalamic tract to get up to the brain. The temperature pathway, we use thermoreceptors instead of nociceptors. Again, we have A deltas and Cs. I'm not going to ask you to know which is cooling and which is warming. It also takes the spinal thalamic tract. So your temperature pathway is going to look the same as your pain pathway. The only thing that's going to be different is what you call the receptor. So if we do our same process here, let's fill in our blanks. So instead of a nociceptor, what do we fill in for that first blank? Then we're going to be opening certain types of ion channels. What types would they be? If we have a strong enough stimulus to get an action potential, what kind of axons does this information travel on? And where's the cell body located? The synapse is going to take place with the second order neuron where in the spinal cord? So filling in our blanks, we have a thermoreceptor now instead of a nociceptor. Still opening modality-gated ion channels. operating on A delta or C, first order afferents, with a cell body in the dorsal root ganglion. They're going to synapse with a second order neuron in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. That second order neuron is going to cross the spinal cord in the anterior white commissure, travel up the spinal thalamic tract to the ventroposterolateral nucleus of the thalamus. It's going to synapse with a third order neuron, which is going to go to the primary somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe. And there we detect and perceive a change in temperature. Again, there's some evidence that, like pain, temperature may not go straight across, but may actually ascend a little bit as it's crossing. And once again, I just want you to put that way in the back of your brain. And we'll talk about it when we talk about a particular spinal cord injury. So here's our drawing again, our elephant drawing. Now let's go ahead and add in the picture. As I mentioned, it should look just like your pain picture, except we now have a different type of receptor. So again, I'm in the skin of the dorsal proximal thumb. So my receptor is now a thermoreceptor. The action potential is traveling on an A delta or C first order afferent in the radial nerve. Its cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglion. It enters the C6 level of the spinal cord through the Lissauer's tract and then synapses with the second order neuron in the dorsal horn. Second order neuron crosses the spinal cord and enters the spinal thalamic tract, where it ascends up, passing through the brainstem to get to the thalamus, where it synapses with the third order neuron, which then is going to go to the lateral aspect of the primary somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe. Now I want you to do some brainstorming. If you have an injury to the spinal thalamic tract, what types of information will be lost? In other words, what kinds of information would you be unable to consciously perceive? Which side would that loss of information be on? Would it be, if you damage the right spinal thalamic tract, would you lose your information on the right side of your body, or would you lose it on the left side of the body? Is it different if the injury to the pain pathway or the temperature pathway is to the peripheral nerve? The example would be the radial nerve and the two that I drew, as opposed to somewhere in the spinal cord, or the brainstem, or the cerebrum, or the cerebral cortex. How would the presentation be different based on the location of your injury? Here is now a chance to again draw out one of those pathways that we've already drawn, so either pain or temperature, and then draw in an injury. And then try and determine where you'd have that sensory loss and where you would not. Where would things be okay? Here we once again have my temperature pathway for a change in temperature on the dorsal aspect of the proximal thumb of my right hand. I have a thermoreceptor with an A delta or C first order afferent that's traveling in the radial nerve. It's entering the spinal cord at the C6 spinal cord segment and synapsing with the second order neuron in the dorsal horn. Second order neuron crosses the spinal cord, enters the spinal thalamic tract, and ascends all the way through the brainstem up to the VPL nucleus of the thalamus, where it synapses with a third order neuron that then goes to the primary somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe in the area representing the thumb. But if I damage this pathway, that's going to impair my ability to perceive sensation in particular areas of my body. In this case, we're going to focus just on the temperature sensation. So we're going to start by damaging the peripheral nerve. So there's my injury. I've damaged my radial nerve. This means that the skin that is innervated by the radial nerve will no longer be able to transmit information about temperature change. So I will not know if something warm or cool is touching the dorsal proximal thumb. Now, if it's the radial nerve, obviously that is not just that area of skin, but it could be the entire kind of dorsal lateral aspect of the hand, or the dorsal central aspect of the forearm, or even the dorsal aspect of the upper arm, depending on where along the radial nerve the injury has taken place. If, however, the injury is in the spinal thalamic tract, I'm going to affect much more than the area of skin innervated by the radial nerve. I'm going to impair the ability to sense temperature change for all areas on the right side of my body that enter the spine, where the sensation enters the spinal cord at the level of C6 and below. Because all of that information that's entering the spinal cord below C6 has to ascend up to the brain through that spinal thalamic tract. I'm only going to affect the right side of my body because that temperature information crosses over in the spinal cord. So if I damage the left spinal thalamic tract, that's going to affect temperature sensation on the right side of my body. Then we make an injury in the brainstem. So now I've had an injury in the brainstem that has damaged the spinal thalamic tract up in the brainstem. I'm now going to affect temperature sensation throughout the right side of my body, regardless of where the information entered into the spinal cord. So even if it entered higher than C6, that information cannot get past that point of injury in the brainstem to get up to the brain. And finally, I'm going to damage my third order neurons in the parietal lobe. And again, this is going to affect temperature sensation on the right side of my body. Exactly where the injury is and how many of those third order neurons are affected would determine exactly where I would see the sensory impairment. If that injury were closer to the cortex, I might see impairment in my upper extremity, but not my lower extremity because of the sensory homunculus, where the lower extremity is represented on the medial side by the longitudinal fissure. It might end up being okay. But if the injury is further down in the cerebrum, if it's deeper, where I'm going to have kind of a bunching up of all of these third order neurons before they fan out across the cortex, I might see a much wider loss of temperature sensation. So at this point, it's a little hard to say exactly what we would find with a cerebral injury, but we can say that it would be on the opposite side of the body that we would lose that temperature sensation. So peripheral nerve injury, the sensory loss is ipsilateral, but once we get into the spinal cord, if we damage the ascending tract, then it's going to be contralateral. Now, obviously, if I were to damage the dorsal horn, I would still have a loss ipsilateral. So I want you to play around with injury locations. Move them around, shift them around. An easy way to do it is to simply draw out your pathway and then take your finger and set it down someplace on the pathway and figure out what you think would happen as far as the sensation. I want you to stop now, take a break, get up, move. Get something to eat, go to the bathroom, maybe even when you come back to sit down, go to a different topic. Look at your other course. Change your focus. And then in a little bit, come back and take a look at part 2 of our ascending somatosensory pathways lecture.